This week on the Hollywood and Toto Podcast, Jimmy Kimmel goes back to work for his masters, the Democratic Party, but in a pretty unusual way. And we talked to author Nat Segaloff about his new book, The Rambo Report. 5 movies, 1 legendary character. I think you're going to like this conversation. So many cool behind-the-scenes stories. And yeah, Rambo matters then and now.
Welcome to the Hollywood and Toto Podcast. Entertainment news and reviews without the woke Hollywood narrative. Free speech, free expression. Now that's entertainment. And here's your host, award-winning film critic, Christian Toto.
Jimmy Kimmel has a curious side hustle. Yeah, I know. He's been busy since 2003 with Jimmy Kimmel Live on ABC, and love or hate Jimmy Kimmel, that's a pretty impressive run. Late night is brutal, and he's been doing it for quite some time. But he also does work on the side for the Democratic Party. Now, we saw that last year pretty aggressively when he not only co-emceed a fundraiser for President Joe Biden, he covered up President Biden's decline. Now, there was an epic freeze-up of President Biden during that event. And later on national TV, Jimmy Kimmel said, "Oh no, he's fine. Don't trust your eyes. Nothing's wrong. Go away. It's a cheap fake."
How could you lie about something so big?
Now, I don't know what the DNC is paying Jimmy Kimmel. Maybe these are in-kind contributions, but if there is some sort of payment going forward, he deserved double that week. That was just going above and beyond the call of duty. Epic work, Jimmy Kimmel. If you can lie like that for us, anything's possible. So bravo. Little golf clap there. And he's been doing it again just this week. Now, Kimmel recently interviewed Governor J.B. Pritzker. He's the overseeing Illinois. There's some problems in that state. But of course, the two of them didn't go into that at all. It's more of a friendly, positive chat. But what they did talk about is Pritzker's weight. Now, Pritzker is a heavyset fellow. There's no escaping that. There's no avoiding that. And in recent weeks, President Trump has made fun of that. And as Ben Shapiro often says, that's bad Trump, because you don't make fun of someone's weight. You make fun of their policies. You make fun of the things they say. And very recently, Pritzker has said some terrible things. He took a page out of Rachel Zegler's playbook, which you never do, and said the Republicans should never know peace. Now, when a dingbat starlet says that, it's embarrassing, it's bad PR, and it could potentially hurt their movies, which it did with Snow White. When a governor says that, when someone of national significance says that, well, that's a terrible thing. It's cruel, and it could inspire violence. Of course, the legacy media, they reviewed it or they talked about it oh so briefly, and then they moved on. No clarifications, no questioning how terrible that kind of a sentiment is. And listen, legacy media is the legacy media. You just can't hate them enough. They stain their legacy on a daily basis, and this is just another example.
What is relevant is the total silence from the mainstream media.
So obviously, Jimmy Kimmel wasn't going to talk up that particular part of Pritzker's shtick. He's going to talk about other things. But one of the things the two of them focused on directly, and which seemed odd at first when you don't, at first glance, is Pritzker's weight. Now, again, Trump made fun of it. Not cool. But then Jimmy Kimmel made fun of it again and again and again.
All of a sudden, you can fat shame.
To J.B. Pritzker's face. He's sitting right there. They're doing fat jokes. I thought fat shaming was just not really cool anymore. You can't make movies like Shallow Hal, for example. You can't make fun of people's weight. It's just cruel. It's problematic. So why is Kimmel doing it to the governor's face?
I suggested that maybe we come up with some nicknames for you that you can give to him, because you just don't want a lame one, you know? Nobody wants a lame nickname.
Here's the list. JB Pizza. Mm-hmm. I like this. JB Back Ribs.
JB back there? Could be a song with that, too, you know?
JBLT.
Uh-huh.
J Biggie.
The governor is smiling about it, laughing about it, just sitting there like a good little victim. What's going on?
We are so confused.
Well, here's exactly what's going on. These things aren't an accident. Now, when it comes to late night television, we have a lot of pre-interviews. That means the producers, the people behind the scenes, will pull aside a guest and say, hey, have you been on vacation recently? Do you have any funny stories or anything you can kind of focus on that would be charming and delightful for our audience? That happens all the time. It's a normal part of late night TV. So all those great interviews, they're really, I don't want to say pre-planned, but certainly there's a thought going into it. There's a momentum to it that is not organic. Okay, just is what it is. And that's doubly so when a political candidate or a governor comes on a show like Jimmy Kimmel Live. They have planned this out. They are not going to throw fat jokes at the governor out of the blue. Unacceptable, would never, ever happen.
Inconceivable.
So the two parties clearly colluded on this. We're going to tell fat jokes. We're going to embrace this issue because they want to defang it. They want to make fun of Trump for saying it. And they want to show that Pritzker, he can roll with the punches. He's fine. He can laugh at himself. Ha, ha, ha. And if he doesn't lose weight between now and 2028, when we're assuming he may run for the presidency, well, he's already accepted this issue. He's embraced this issue. He's discarded this issue, and we can all laugh about it. Heck, he's just like us. So that's what Jimmy Kimmel does. He is a shill for the Democrats. He's proven it again and again and again. He recently told Rolling Stone magazine that his show now is a place for people to scream. We just lost Ruth Buzzy, a great comic actress, and she was just all about the funny. It just seems like the complete opposite of what a Ruth Buzzy would do is what Jimmy Kimmel's doing now. He cares about partisanship. He cares about scoring points. He cares about pushing Democrats forward. He cares about attacking Trump. And the one thing he doesn't care as much about, it's laughter. It's comedy. There's screaming and there's laughter. Kimmel wants to scream.
I'm so angry.
Well, that's wonderful. And I just don't know how, as a late night comedian, that really flies. Enough people still watch the show. I guess it's therapeutic for liberals. But at the end of the day, you would think that a late night host would be all about the funny. Not Jimmy Kimmel. It's all about his masters, the Democrats. And he will do whatever they want him to do to make sure that that message comes forward. And that's not remotely funny. In the field, we had a code of honor. You watch my back, I watch yours. Back here, we got nothing. Sir, do we get to win this time? They drew first blood. That's the wit and wisdom of John Rambo, of course, the star of 5 action movies spreading across decades, famously played by Sylvester Stallone, one of his 2 iconic heroes, Rocky Balboa and John Rambo. Very different figures, very different souls, and endless conversations about what they mean in the big picture. Sometimes they overlap directly with pop culture. Sometimes they intersected with politics. Sometimes presidents name-check them along the way. That's the Rambo history. That's the Rambo legacy. And it's all covered in the new book, The Rambo Report, by author Nat Segaloff. Now, what Segaloff does is he captures all 5 films, gives us descriptions of what happened on screen, talks to the author who first wrote First Blood and who set this whole project in motion, so much more. Even the actors who were considered to play John Rambo along the way, how Kirk Douglas intersected with the franchise oh so briefly. There's so much interesting information here. And if you're a movie fan, if you're a Rambo fan, if you love Sylvester Stallone in particular, there's lots of great details about him, the way he worked behind the scenes. Listen, he's a big star and he's got a big ego and he got stuff done. And it's fascinating to behold. And for all these reasons, I wanted to have Nat on the show. Now, Nat is a published author. He's got so many books to his credit. He's been a movie publicist. He's been a professor. Just everything you can imagine Nat has done. A couple of his more memorable titles include The Exorcist Legacy, 50 Years of Fear, and Say Hello to My Little Friend, A Century of Scarface. Great books and great titles, too. So I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Nat about the Rambo Report, about John Rambo specifically, Sylvester Stallone's character, and why we're still talking about it today. And we are, and we should be. Well, Nat, thanks for joining the show. Now, you've done so much writing around Hollywood. I'm curious, why Rambo and why now? It's a great topic, and I think at any point along the way, along this franchise, you could have tackled it, but it does feel kind of like a zeitgeist moment in a way, just because of Stallone, because of politics, because of Hollywood, because of this figure who still remains so much of a part of us. Talk a little bit sort of entering this project, because it sounds like a slam dunk for me, but you're the writer. What was the impetus for this book?
A couple of the Venn diagrams had to overlap before it actually worked out to write the Rambo Report. Mm-hmm. One of them was that my publisher seems to like me writing about franchises. I've done The Exorcist Legacy, about the Exorcist books. I've done Scarface. I'm talking about them with some more. And publishers have two things that make them really aroused. One of them is nice, even-numbered anniversaries of movies, and Rambo is 40, the second one is 40, and franchises. And I seem to be branded at Kensington Citadel as the franchise guy. The other thing was that David Morrell, who wrote the original novel in 1972, First Blood, is an old friend of mine. We've known each other for years, since Sterling Silliphant introduced us, and it never occurred to either of us, maybe we should sit down and do the actual Rambo book. And the third one, of course, is the notion of Rambo being a kind of a symbol for American involvement in other cultures and other countries around the world, quite literally for the last 50 years. And I thought I could combine them all and write about Rambo's influence. And also, as it turns out, write about veterans and veterans affairs, and talk about the very important issue of PTSD, which is addressed in the book.
You know, when you think about the Rambo saga at the very beginning in the original book form, he dies. Obviously, you had to kind of change that. This is Hollywood, and certainly Stallone had an eye for sequels. Talk a little bit about sort of that pivotal moment, and do you think that the powers that be beyond Stallone suspected the longevity this character would have?
It was a surprise to everybody, including Stallone and the producers. In the original First Blood, John Rambo comes back from Vietnam. He's searching for the last of his connections, a man named Delroy, Delmar, who was supposedly the last person to serve in his platoon. He's gone. A sheriff routs him out of town, and Rambo says, "I'm not going to take it anymore." And it's really the first time that an American soldier comes back and wages war against America. In this case, an America who didn't appreciate the veterans, which was very much the case in the early 1970s. That was the genesis of First Blood. At the end of First Blood, Rambo dies. Now, when the movie was made, they put a scene at the end. And by the way, I'm not concerned about spoilers, because if you haven't seen the movie by now, tough, you should have seen it.
That's on you.
Rambo is supposedly killed by Colonel Troutman, the man who created him, which is a kind of a poetic closure. But in the movie, they have it so that Rambo actually helps Troutman kill him in a scene that was deleted, but is available on some versions on the DVD. And after they shot that scene, Stallone huddled with director Ted Kotcheff and said, I think Rambo has to live, because I don't want to give the message to veterans that the only way out of your problem is to die. Which I thought was a terrifically uplifting thing and a very wise thing to do. And so they shot the other ending while they were up there. Now, there's some dispute as to whether they all went back and shot it later or there, but both Crenna and everyone else says, no, we shot it there. We did the ending as it is now in the film. But of course, when they decided to make a sequel, they said, well, it's a good thing we didn't kill him. And in the book, when David Morrell was novelizing the scripts for numbers 2 and 3, he wasn't sure how to bring Rambo back, because it wasn't like, The Bride of Frankenstein, where the monster falls through the floorboards. He simply said, very simply, in my book, Rambo dies. In the movies, he lives. And then we're off on the adventure of Rambo First Blood Part 2. So the sequel wasn't really envisioned at the time. They had no idea the film was going to take off like that. But when it did, they said, we better make a sequel. And then the whole scrambling around to make the sequel is part of the story in the Rambo Report, how these guys really had a tiger by the tail.
The book really does a great job of illustrating the behind-the-scenes chaos, the star power, the deals, the wheeling and dealing. But I was curious, drill down a little more into why First Blood was so unique. You mentioned a soldier basically declaring war in his own country. This wasn't a typical action movie by any stretch. I mean, Stallone doesn't speak that much. Talk about how unique it was at the time. And I think it's such a different beast than the other Rambo films, but it is such a unique property.
There's a couple of differences between the book and the movie that I think answer the question you just raised. Mm-hmm. In the book, which was really one of the first action novels, and In First Blood was really one of the modern action films. Remember, it was 1982, but they weren't making a lot of shoot-'em-up films. That was really one of the first action films in the modern sense of a hero going out and doing something. And that is that in the book, Rambo kills everybody. In the movie, he doesn't kill anyone. In the movie, they kept him kind of pure in a way. Anybody who dies, whether it's Galt falling out of the helicopter or guys who try to run him off the road or others, everyone dies by their own folly. That was important to keep Rambo almost pure. Now, he does cause a lot of other trouble, which is why he's on a rock pile at the beginning of the second film. But they wanted to keep his character more honest, more pure, and only reactive to other people who were doing things to him. That, I think, was a very wise decision. And because the great actors know how to react more than act, it was perfect for Stallone, who nevertheless, I think, turns in just a spectacular job, especially in the first half of the film. And I don't think he's been given enough credit for it.
Yeah, he's such an interesting presence because he has this Palooka-like image, handsome, muscular, and yet through the years, I've just always been impressed by how smart, how intuitive he is. I mean, I don't think you get to be a movie star and a TV star into your late 70s without having a sense of star power, what the public wants. I mean, I can go on and on. What's your sense of Stallone? Because in the book, you see ego, you see control, you see wisdom, you see intelligence. It's about Rambo, but your book does really capture Stallone in a fascinating way.
There's a great line in Billy Wilder's and Charles Brackett's Sunset Boulevard when everybody talks about Norman Desmond. And Cecil B. DeMille says, a dozen press agents working overtime can do terrible things to the human spirit. Stallone has been clawed at, grabbed at, maligned so many times over the years. And by the way, some of it was quite warranted. Mm-hmm. I think Christopher Reeve said, for 2 years after you become a star, you don't go to the bathroom. And I think Stallone probably made some enemies along the way and was very difficult. But let's face it, he was the guy on whose shoulders these films were resting. He can't take any chances. He's the guy they're going to criticize. If he doesn't say hello to a crew member one day, they'll say, oh, well, Sly is just being stuck up. When in fact, he has a lot of stuff to go through. Now, mind you, he also sometimes doesn't treat people very well. There were tons of firings on his films, and he wanted his certain vision to be exercised, and he sometimes didn't know how to achieve the vision himself, so he would get rid of other people to do it. That's what happens if you're a star, unfortunately. But he also makes hundreds of millions of dollars for people, and so that is tolerated. I think his transition from First Blood, which is kind of an interesting downplayed film until it takes off, to the other Rambo films, really talks about how Stallone himself became a major action star. When they put him in First Blood, he was not a major star. He was just the guy who was in Rocky, and no one figured that he could play this action figure. But he rose to the occasion, to say the least.
The franchise really evolved in many, many ways and became kind of a, in some eyes, a gung-ho, Reagan-esque franchise in ways that don't really align with the first movie in the film. Talk about how that image evolved and how it overlapped with the political machinations at the time.
It's interesting you mentioned Reagan because the president in 1985 touted how wonderful First Blood 2 Rambo was and how he said Reagan was obviously a Republican because he's able to go around and enforce things. And Stallone instantly reacted and said, Rambo is not political. And whatever Stallone's views were was quite different. But Rambo is not political, and he still is never political in the entire series. He's fighting for a cause. Now, it may be a lost cause in some cases, but it's a cause that is a point of honor. He's going back to rescue his creator. He's going back to rescue his adoptive daughter in the fifth film. He's working with some missionaries in Burma and other times. He's the lone man. He's Charon going across the river. He's the man who is bringing some sort of solution to pain. And that is really the tragedy of Rambo as a character and as a man. He's not really at home unless he's fighting somebody. What a horrible fate to confer upon somebody. He's defined by the number of people that he kills.
One of the things I found so fascinating about your book is that a lot of the cultural conversations about the film, how it overlapped with the real world, about Stallone, it felt like it could have been written that these fights were happening today and not in the 1980s or even beyond then. Were you intrigued by that part of it, how sort of the some of the cultural conversations around the film and its real world implications, it felt very modern to me in a way.
One of the most difficult things that film critics have to do, and that film students sometimes have trouble grasping, is to put themselves into the context in which a particular old film was released. In fact, when I was teaching film criticism at Boston University, that was the biggest trick. They would see wide shoulders on Rosalind Russell in a 1941 movie, and they'd say how out of date the film was. Well, yeah, it was out of date. It's 40 years old. But that's the trick that critics have to do. And when people watch the Rambo movies, which are very much relics of their time, and yet describe their time, they have to remember what was going on in the world. I didn't set out to write a political book, but I knew that I could follow Rambo through 50 years and see the history of America's intervention in other cultures and subsuming them if I simply wrote about what the films were about. In the first one, he's come home. In the second one, he goes back to Vietnam. In the third one, he's in Afghanistan. Then he goes to Burma. Then he goes into Mexico. Each of these describes a place that America found themselves either entangled or invading in one way or another, culturally or militarily. And Rambo, in this case, was the symbol of that.
It is fascinating. You know, and I think along the way, when you have an artist like Stallone, who's so near and dear to a character, much like Rocky Balboa, I don't see him phoning it in. I sense a real attachment to this figure. Like you mentioned, Stallone's personal politics maybe not align with Rambo, and he kept those two apart. Talk about how Stallone has managed to be successful for so long. I'm intrigued by that. I've enjoyed the first two seasons of Tulsa King. It's not a great show. It's not art, but it's wildly entertaining, and he's so good in it. Just talk about how do you make what keeps a star like Stallone ticking in a way?
Listen, if I could answer that, I'd be the star, and he'd be writing books about me. You know, how does anybody know how Willy Wonka makes the best chocolates?
That's right.
It's something that he is and does, that he recognized it himself and managed to pull out and sharpen. I don't know how it's done. We search for them all the time, and he's one of the last few big effing stars around.
Yeah. I don't want to give too much away, but there's sort of a sub-theme in the book where Stallone had many interviews with a certain journalist. And it's worth reading the book for that alone. It's so precious and so interesting. And I don't want to give much more of it away, but I just found that particularly fascinating as someone who's interviewed actors over the time, and obviously you have as well.
Yeah, I'm hoping to get a call from Stallone saying, well, "What did you write about me?" You know, he wasn't available for me to interview him. And wasn't available is a nice euphemism, for his agent stood in my way. And believe me, I tried over and over again.
Yeah.
One agent said, "How much will you pay?" Another agent said he's working on his memoirs. There's no reason he couldn't talk to me for 2 hours. His memoirs, by the way, are called The Steps, and it's coming out in October. But there was so much information about him anyway out there. And I was able to obtain interviews that were shot for one of the earlier DVD releases, which have never been released, for some of the actors like Richard Crenna and Brian Dennehy, who have since passed. And I was able to use that material with permissions and with clearances and reveal them for the first time in the book. I mean, there's nothing scandalous, but there certainly is a lot of stuff that I think is interesting in the Rambo Report.
Absolutely. And we mentioned prior to the mics going on, I really felt you can hear Stallone's voice throughout the book. So even though you didn't get him per se, you've had so many sort of archival interviews. His voice is ever present. Do you think that looking back at the franchise that we've misunderstood it to a certain degree, or it's one that's been analyzed aggressively over the years for all the obvious reasons, but are there misconceptions we still have about the Rambo series?
Well, there are, and there's one that we talked about when you and I spoke for the book, and that is the subject of racism. And I'm going to raise it now because I think that's a false flag. The films have been criticized in some ways as being racist, but I'll tell you, that's not the intent of the filmmakers from everything I could tell, from any of the notes or anything else. And also, when you make a war film and you set the war film in another country, the people in that country are going to be of a particular race. I mean, that's if you want a hamburger, you go to McDonald's. That's where they live. And that, I think, now the other problem, and again, we've discussed this because you're an expert in this as well. If you create a villain but don't give them enough textures or details so they become just a paper villain, yes, there is the temptation to say that it was a racist construct. But the villains in the Rambo films, the particular ones that he fights mano a mano, are quite well developed. Whether it's the Vietnamese colonel, the Russians who intercede, the enemies in Afghanistan, or those in Burma, these are pretty well developed. but it's not every single character of the hundreds of thousands who were there. So I don't believe the intent of the films is racist. I believe they can be misinterpreted that way. And certainly there are some people who think so. But it's a movie, for Christ's sake. It's a war film. And you're not going to make the enemy the equal to our side. Otherwise, you'll never care how it comes out.
Yeah, I think if you kind of cast aspersions on films with one-dimensional characters, you might be here all day, because there's a lot of films that fall into that category. I want to briefly mention Last Rambo, which I was disappointed by. It felt short. It felt really aggressively violent in a way that didn't really seem, I mean, listen, Rambo is always violent, but it just seemed over the top. I want to maybe put your film critic hat on. What did you think of the last installment?
Well, we agree completely. In fact, so does David Morrell, who says the last Rambo film, Rambo 5 or Last Blood, is not really a Rambo film. It's just, well, frankly, I think it's a Liam Neeson film where he goes out and gets somebody. His surrogate or his adoptive daughter is kidnapped and overdosed by a Mexican drug and white slaving cartel, and he goes into Mexico to try to avenge it. Now, the original script is actually quite elegant and beautifully written, but it was cut down quite a bit to make the movie. In the original script, there's a woman journalist who helps him. Well, her sister was taken previously by these same group of people, and they're actually equals. Mm-hmm. But Stallone, I guess, didn't want to have a woman who was fighting alongside him, although he didn't mind that in Rambo 2. Yeah. The other problem with the film is it is just damned incoherent. If you look at some of the violent scenes, maybe they darkened them so they would get a more beneficial motion picture rating. Maybe they cut. I don't know what it is. But when Rambo goes chasing the bad guys in the tunnels under his house, you don't know what's happening. Yeah. And it's just an inept film. Although it does have some wonderful moments in it, and I think his heart's in the right place, it simply doesn't work dramatically, certainly not what was left of it. Now, if you look at the film in the international version, which is available, I believe, on YouTube for a subscription, they add 10 minutes at the beginning, which really makes the whole film make sense. In the beginning of Rambo 5, there's a huge monsoon. Now, how there's a monsoon in Arizona, I've never figured that out, but there is. And he tries to rescue some hikers who were caught in the rain, and he can't rescue them all. And he feels guilt that he wasn't able to achieve his mission. And this guilt drives him, especially motivates him to go into Mexico and to try to rescue his adoptive daughter. Without that first 10 minutes, which doesn't look like a Rambo film, unfortunately, but it is, that explains his character for the rest of the movie. And it was folly to have cut that out. But you can still see it if you want to buy it on one of the streaming services.
That's very frustrating, but I mean, Hollywood is littered with stories where certain great scenes are cut out or maybe too much is put back in. Before I let you go, Nat, franchises never die. Stallone doesn't let go of franchises. Certainly, he has that instinct within him. And there has been talk of prequels. Do you know anything about that? Is there any sort of more recent chatter about extending this? I mean, he's 78 now. I don't think it'd be wise on many levels for him to revisit the character directly. But is there any sense that this story could continue?
Those rumors pop up every now and then that there's going to be a sequel, a prequel, or a television series. You know, the son of Rambo is instructed by his father to go in and clean up. But as Stallone said, if he was offered Rambo today, he'd have to say Pasadena, which is his trendy way of saying pass. He simply couldn't physically do it. If you look at him in the fifth film, you're wondering if there's CGI. There isn't. I mean, they could youthen him somewhat. But I think Stallone has reached the elder statesman status where he knows what he can do and he can be entertaining. I can't speak for him, of course, but I do believe that the Rambo franchise will live in memory rather than in current experience.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It would be interesting to see what they do with modern political climate, experiences across the globe. I mean, there is that potential, but I also would hate to see it without Stallone's fingerprints all over it. I mean, it is his baby, and it seems like it would be.
I mean, if maybe they made they'd probably have Rambo handling drones. He wouldn't go down. You know, so it wouldn't happen. We've been defining ourselves out of it.
Exactly. Before I let you go, do you have any other books in the works or projects? I know you wear many, many hats. So I was just kind of curious what's next on your.
Thank you for asking. When I was waiting for Kensington to approve the manuscript I sent them for the Rambo Report, I was able to write another book. And the other book is called Bogart and Houston. It's about Humphrey Bogart and John Huston, the 6 films they made together, which include The Maltese Falcon, The African Queen, and Treasure of the Sierra Madre, and the adventures they had as people with their 9 wives and with all sorts of things in Hollywood. It's really a fun storybook that goes into 6 of the most interesting films ever made. And I'm very proud of that. That's coming out in August. There's a difference. And also in August, I have the paperback edition of my Exorcist book, the Exorcist Legacy, with an additional chapter and more information about the most recent Exorcist film in that franchise.
Interesting. That's a dispiriting chapter, I imagine, but a necessary one all the same.
Idea.
Well, Nat, thank you so much for joining the show, for sharing your insights. The book is The Rambo Report. I highly recommend it. I haven't seen the Rambo films in quite some time. I'm going to be revisiting them very, very soon. Your book made me do that, but just so many great behind the scenes stories. You're not going to believe we didn't get into this. Some of the actors who could have been Rambo along the way, that is worth the price of admission just by itself. But you can check out the book, The Rambo Report, at Amazon or your favorite bookseller. And Nat, thanks for shedding a light on this amazing franchise and for all the work you do behind the scenes at Hollywood. You're making these films come alive in a unique way.
Well, thank you, Christian, for this opportunity to speak to your viewers and listeners. And also, by the way, for your help in getting the book written, because some of your comments are the most astute in the entire book. And I want to thank you again so much for your openness and for your willingness and for your point of view and your beliefs. Thank you.
It was pure accidental, but I appreciate it. Your character actor of the week is Beth Grant. Well, that's it for the show this week. Again, thank you to Radio America for having me as part of their great podcast lineup. I do hope you'll check out HollywoodInToto.com. It is my website now in its 11th year, and it's got news, reviews, commentary, everything about pop culture from a right-of-center perspective. And, one of the things I like to do on this show and on the website, too, is to connect dots that maybe aren't being connected, to cover the stories that aren't being covered, to find new and different angles to entertainment pieces that are being talked about right now. But, maybe this part of the conversation needs more volume. Put it up to 11, as they say in Spinal Tap.
What day did the Lord create Spinal Tap, and couldn't he have rested on that day too?
And if you're enjoying the show, please give it a like, a subscribe, a share, do anything to kind of help those algorithms push it out to the masses. We'd appreciate it. Well, everyone have a wonderful weekend. Doctor's orders.